Hi viewers, today as we're in lockdown, we're going to play Streaky's quiz game. It's the mix and master quiz. Yep, no expense spared on this little number, literally no expense spared. Go get yourself a pen, a piece of paper, I'm going to ask you some questions. Is it a mix thing or is it a mastering thing? As I just said, I'm going to ask you some questions and you're going to have the answer, is it a mix thing or is it a mastering thing? The reason I come to this is because every time I do a Q&A and every time I speak to people and sort of teach them about mastering and tell them what I do and blah, blah, people that come in the studio always seem to think that what I'm doing is something that should be done at the mix stage, and then what is done at the mix stage can be something that's done at the mastering stage. So there seems to be quite a lot of mix up between mixing and mastering. So this is why we're doing Streaky's magic quiz today there's about 7 questions, and is it a mix thing or is it a mastering thing? So here we go. Question number 1. De-essing vocals. Is it something that you should do in the mix or is it something you should do in mastering? Question number 2. Adding reverb to the whole track. Is it a mix thing? Is it a mastering thing? Question number 3. Adjusting the stereo width. Better to do it in mixing or in mastering? Question number 4. Adding EQ, compression, effects to individual stems. Mixing, mastering. Question number 5. I've got a really loud rim shot in the track. Mixing, mastering. Hope you're following along. Question number 6 is adding a limiter to get level. Mix or mastering? And finally, question number 7, parallel compressing the bass. Mix thing, mastering thing. So that's the 7 questions. I hope that you've written down the answers. Now let's have a little whiz through and let me give you some descriptions of what I think the difference is between whether it should be a mix thing or a mastering thing. So get your answers ready, here we go. Question number 1 was de-essing vocals. Now, this is a bit of a trick question because it can happen in both. In mixing, it's obviously best to try and do it in mixing because you can do it on the individual track and you can kind of get it so that you can get it sitting in the mix how you want, you can re-EQ it, you've got a lot more control. But having said that, at mastering stage, you can still de-ess the vocal, you can get in there, but the problem you have there is that you'll have other things in the frequency range, like snares, guitars, stuff like that. So you can take a little bit of edge off and you can't have as much control. So I would always say it veers a little bit more on mixing than it does in mastering, but you can do the two. So it is both of them, bit of a trick question, but I'd veer more towards getting it done in the mix. And if you are a mastering engineer and you can send it back to the mix engineer, it's not a big deal, do it there. Question number 2 was adding reverb to the stereo track. Now that is a mix thing. It's definitely not a mastering thing. It's a mix thing. Now, a lot of people say to me, do you add reverb at mastering? And no, I would never do that. Some people have done it in the past to try and thicken the track up. But for me, it's not something that you need to do these days because we're past the stage of when you were recalling mixes in the past, it was really difficult to recall a mix because you've got to get everything back up in an analog way on the outboard gear, and it was a nightmare. So you'd try and get away with kind of thickening the mix up at a mastering stage. These days there's no need because people can get their mixes back quite quickly. So if somebody wanted to put reverb across the whole thing, it's quite a creative process. There's a lot of different types of reverbs you can use and a lot of different sounds you can produce. So it'd be something that I'd really want the mix engineer to do to make that critical decision, and then I can take it on from there. And a lot of the time, if you're adding reverb across the whole mix, it can make it sound a little bit swashy. If it's a kind of orchestral track, you can get away with it, but a lot of the time you will lose a lot of transients and a lot of the kind of snap and a lot of the edge that you want to get in mastering. So by adding loads of reverb, it kind of defeats the object on that. It's track dependent, but always do it in the mix rather than at a mastering stage. Question number 3, adjusting the stereo width. Is it a mix thing or a mastering thing? Well, again, it is both, but I would veer more on a mastering thing because in a mix stage, yes, you can change stereo width, but that's more of a panning and sort of adding reverbs and things like that to get it sounding wide. So that's really a mix thing. But I think what we're talking about here is just adding a slight bit of width to give it some sort of just liven the track up a little bit. I don't like using them. They're stereo width plugins. I prefer to use an EQ in MS mode and just change the outside of on the stereo side of things, just move those out a bit. With stereo width plugins, I find that it kind of stretches all of the bass out and everything, and it kind of makes it really phasey and weird, unless you've of course monoed the bass before you get to that stage, but that's another detail. So I would say do it at mastering, be very subtle with it. Try not to use a stereo width plugin too much if that's all you've got, but failing that, use a EQ in MS mode and just bring it out a touch. But really pay attention to the phase, because it can sound super weird if you go too wide. And also, if you're using a stereo width plugin, you put it on, it's really wide and it sounds really exciting and great. And that's what happens every time, isn't it, when you get a new plugin? But with a spreader, it kind of goes, wow, you go, oh, it sounds brilliant. But then when you actually listen to it back a few days later, you'll hate it. So don't go too mad. So yeah, that's it, stereo width mastering. Question number 4 is adding EQ, compression and effects to individual stems. Now that is definitely a mixing thing. Now some people get this confused because they think about stem mastering, and they think that if I'm doing stem mastering, I'm going to be adding some EQ and things to each individual stem. Now, yes, you can do that if you've got the stems, but I would prefer if it was done at mix stage, because if I'm doing stem mastering, really what I want to do is just change the balance if I have to. And I can do that de-essing thing that I was talking about earlier on the vocal stem if that's there. But really, all of those things, they're quite creative, and you want to get it done at the mix stage. You don't want to be waiting until mastering to get that done, unless of course you can't do it at the mix stage. If you were on outboard or you can't get the stuff back and you've only got the stems, fine, you've got to do it. But really, we're getting into stem mixing there and not stem mastering. There's a very sort of grey line between the two, but really you want to be doing all your compression, EQ and effects at mix stage, whether that's stem mixing or a full mix, but you want to have it done there before you get to mastering, because mastering isn't about the individual instruments. Mastering is about the stereo image and the veneer of the track, not the little sections. So yeah, definitely a mix thing for me, that one. Question number 5, EQing the rim shot down. Now, I get asked about this in mastering a lot. I've got this sort of thing that's popping out the mix. Can you EQ that? Can you do that? That's a mix thing again. So I would really rather go back to the mix engineer if it's possible and just say, can you give us a small tweak on this? I think it's standing out too much, because if I start taking away EQ, or if I start compressing in that area with something like a dynamic EQ or with a multi-band compressor, I'm going to start affecting the other instruments within that part of the sound. So I would rather go back to the mix engineer that I've got a relationship with and just say, look, just drop it down half a dB or a dB, or just change the EQ a little bit on it, and I think we're going to get a much better sound, because it won't be taken away from everything else in that frequency range. So always try and go back to the mix and sort those kind of things out there and work with the mix engineer to get that right. And if you are a mix engineer, then obviously you want that from a mastering engineer, because that's why you're going there, because you want that kind of extra set of ears, that kind of person that wasn't involved through the process of making the track. They're just there listening to it as a listener will listen to it. And that is part of the main thing about being a mastering engineer. It's not really a massively creative process. That is the thing that a lot of people find frustrating, but because it is just like a quality control time for you to get it out to the media outlets in the right way so it sounds right. And you should have all of those little tweaks like EQs and stuff done on the individual instruments at mix stage, so that when it's coming to mastering, we're just dealing with the veneer and getting it sound nice. So I would say if you've got an instrument that's sticking out too much, doing too, and you're trying to EQ out, you're going to end up just going around the houses trying to EQ a problem that you could probably do in 2 minutes by someone just recalling the mix. And like I keep saying, it's so easy to recall mixes now, because most mix engineers that I know are in the box. So yeah, that's a mix one. Keep it in the mix area. Question number 6, using a limiter to get level. Now, that for me is only a mastering thing, never ever a mix thing. Now, people will put a limiter on the end of their mix bus, which is fine to sort of get a level of how it's going to sound when it's at a full level. But the problem you have there is if you send that off to a mastering guy, or if you are using that as your mastering track, it's always going to be smashed, crushed, all the peat's going to be taken off, you've lost all the dynamics, there's not a lot you can do with it. So if you do it at mix stage, use a limiter, then you have to take it off to give that to the mastering guy. So I would never leave a limiter on a mix. So it is a mastering thing. You need a limiter when you're mastering. That is the sound of a finished track. That's how we're getting our level. That's how we're getting it to be loud. We're pushing into a limiter. How much you push into that limiter, well, that's totally up to you and totally up to the track and what you're trying to achieve. But most of the time you're having a limiter on the end to shave the peaks off and just push into it. That's the sound we like. That is the sound of a finished record. So a lot of the time, give the mastering engineer your mix without a limiter on, and also give him the limited version, because then he's got something to listen to see how loud you liked it and how it was. But definitely give him the unlimited version. Don't use it as the main master, and then let the mastering guy do all the work, because then he'll have some headroom to play with and you'll be surprised how much further he can take it than you've already taken it. So yeah, that's definitely a mastering thing. So the final question, parallel compressing the bass. Now this is something that people talk to me about a lot. Is it a mix thing? Is it a mastering thing? Loads of mastering guys use parallel compression in the low end to get this big beefy sound. Now that was true, and it was a mastering thing in the 80s and early 90s, before we were kind of mixing in the box and having all these different tricks and loads of gear and you know, all that stuff. But now it's definitely a mix thing. Now a lot of mix engineers I know will use parallel compression across loads of different instruments to get the sound beefy and stuff. So by the time it comes to mastering, it's already been kind of pushed as much as it can. You're already got a very heavily compressed track a lot of the time. So by doing parallel compression on the low end, you're not really going to be gaining much. You're more likely to make it really fluffy and thick and horrible, and then you're going to have to cut into that, or you're going to have to kind of then compress it again to hold it down. So a lot of the times people don't do it in mastering now. The reason they used to do it, as I just said, in the 80s and 90s was to get this massive low end sound. And I know a load of it was that kind of American New York sound that people used to get, because it made, if you were going to vinyl, which you were mainly then, and CD, and you were sort of dealing with mixes coming out of all sorts of places, they hadn't been doing a lot of parallel compression at that point. So to do it at mastering stage gave this really beefy low end, and it sounded great on vinyl, because you know the vinyl then sort of limited that down a little bit when you put some cuts on at 40 hertz and you sort of monoed the bass up again, so you sort of trimmed it down. And so by whacking a load of parallel compression on and then cutting to disc, it sounded fantastic. But we're not cutting to disc all the time now. A lot of the stuff has already been parallel compressed to death by the time it comes to mastering. So definitely keep it in the mix zone and don't put it into mastering, because you're more likely to make it sound thick and horrible, and you don't really want that kind of low end. So keep it in the mix. I don't ever do parallel compression in the low end, and I don't know any mastering engineers that do these days. I'm quite open to all ideas, so if you do, let me know, and let me know how you've done it and if it's worked and why. In the comments, obviously, like all of these answers, I'd love to hear your feedback on all of them. But for me, that's a mixed thing. I don't know any mastering engineers that do parallel compression in the low end these days, so that's definitely a mixed thing and not a mastering thing. Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed our mix and master Q&A. I hope that's sort of cleared the waters a little bit on the difference between mixing and mastering. It's not really a dark art, really, mastering. You're looking at the final veneer. The one thing I'd leave you with is the two things are totally different things. The way I always think to separate it up is do this in one DAW and then do this in another DAW, and do it a couple of days after each other, because you're going to have a totally different opinion on it coming from mix stage and then splitting the day off or putting it into another session just as a stereo file. Because if you start mixing the two together in some kind of way, then what you're going to do, you can always go back to the mix and keep changing stuff and tweaking, and then you're in mix mode really, and you're never going to hear the track as a finished article in the sort of just the veneer of how it's going to sound. And I can always, 99.9% of the time, take someone who is a mix engineer or someone who's mixed something and they've mastered it, they've given me their home master, and I will get at least 20% better out of it. And I'm not just bigging myself up, I know that's true for most mastering engineers. And the reason for that is because the mix engineer's taking it to the best they can with the mix. They've made it sound perfect how they wanted it. So when they go to master it, they're really just going to turn it up a little bit. They're not going to do anything else to it because they've already done that at the mix stage. So when I come to it with fresh ears, I can then get a little bit more out of it than they sort of even perceived was possible, because otherwise they'd have done it there. So that's really why I see them as two definite separate processes. Let me know all of your questions in the comments. Let me know how many you got right, how many you got wrong in the comments below. Can't wait to see that, and give me any feedback on the answers that I've given, because I'm not always right, but I'm not always wrong. So let me know in the comments what you think, and until next time, enjoy the lockdown. Stay well. And then you're going to tell me, oh no, the reason I've come, oh fucking hell, it's fucking, question number 5. Is it 5? I've got a really keep doing that afterwards. So that's why, on the track, obviously, if you've got something that's like orchestral or something, it might work, but you lose a lot. The fuck is that?